Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Naruto fall in love with Aayla Secura, part 2, subscribe if you enjoy the video, let's start the story. Watch out. Naruto moved with speed, diving through the air and colliding with the GD Knight, sending the two of them sprawled on the forest floor in a heap. He heard several strange pangs and saw streaks of crimson light flash past the spot where Aayla stood just a moment ago. It didn't matter that those weapons didn't have blades, they were deadly. Aayla flipped to her feet. That strange energy sword ignited in her hands just in time to block a handful of those crimson streaks, sending a few back at the men who were firing them. Naruto didn't quite get what was going on, but he knew which side of the field he was on. Quickly the blonde threw his wind-imbued kunai, watching with some grim satisfaction as one pierced right into an ARC trooper's throat, sending blood spattering across the ground. The remaining four began to spread out, their focus still on his comrade as she continued to deflect those strange energy blasts. They were going to try and catch her in a crossfire, hoping that their weapons would overwhelm her defenses. Naruto could tell that she was confused and his suspicion was proven when she spoke. "Captain, what is the meaning of this?" Briggs didn't answer, instead he fired another volley at the GD Knight, forcing her to take a step back as she continued to block with her blue energy sword. They had almost completely forgotten about Naruto, probably thinking his kunai was one of their crimson bolts deflected back at the user. That would be their last mistake. Still crouched, he brought his hands together in a cross-shaped sign and taking a deep breath, surged his chakra, Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. There was an explosion of white smoke and before the ARC troopers knew it, they found themselves surrounded by 20 perfect clones of him. The shadow clones didn't wait for the smoke to disperse and threw themselves into the battle, katana and kunai drawn and ready to attack. These soldiers were well trained though, and with almost lightning-fast reflexes spun around and fired full salvos of crimson energy into the throng of clones, taking out 5 before the rest began jumping in chakra-propelled leaps, rushing across the tree trunks and tossing a small cloud of kunai and shuriken. An ARC fell back, blood gushing from a kunai embedded in his neck. Another stumbled as several shuriken dug into his breastplate but failed to puncture the armor. He shrugged it off and bringing his weapon up began firing again. 2 more clones exploded in puffs of white smoke, the crimson lances piercing them. Naruto grit his teeth, he needed to get closer, needed to turn this fight into one of taijutsu and kenjutsu. Aayla flew forward, lightsaber in hand, ducking under the captain's weapon and neatly cut the barrel in half. The officer stumbled back and the GD took full advantage, fluidly coming forward to separate his head from his shoulders. The helm flew far into the forest, vanishing from sight. 3 down, 2 to go. A million questions threatened to overtake her mind as she fought. Chief among them was why had her own soldiers turned against her like this? What the hell could have happened for an elite ARC team to suddenly turn on her? Then there was Naruto, who had just shown a number of abilities she had never heard of before. This young man had just shown that he could kill an elite ARC trooper with nothing more than a throwing knife and had created nearly 20 illusions of himself to combat the forces against him. It wasn't his usage of the force, it felt like something deeper, tied to his own body like a second energy. He had called upon it and created this mass of illusions to confront her now turncoat troopers. Only advanced masters could use the force in such a way, if he was even using the force at all. Then she watched as the last 10 fell on the clones and plunged kunai and shuriken into their bodies. Her breath caught in her throat. Those were not illusions. They were solid deadly clones. Not even advanced masters of the force were capable of such feats. The 10 copies stood up, leaving the ARC troopers unmoving on the forest floor. There was an explosion of white smoke as the clones dispelled, leaving only the original Naruto standing in the middle of a circle of corpses. He approached her, sheathing his katana into the sheath at the small of his back. What the hell was that? She shook her head, eyes refusing to leave Briggs' headless body. "I have no idea." "The captain got a message," Naruto said as he came within a few feet of the GD Knight, a figure dressed in a black robe, told him to execute Order 66. "Order 66, Aayla repeated the word with a frown. She had never heard of such an order, but the words left a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. Was this an isolated incident, just a squad of turncoats trying to assassinate her? Or was this happening in other places as well? What about Barris and the 3 Padawans? She exploded into motion with force-propelled speed, shooting across the clearing and into the trees in a blur. Naruto stared after her, frowning, before he gathered the chakra into the soles of his feet and took off after her. He jumped high, landing on a branch, and took off after her from the tree branches. Aayla was fast, and he doubted he would have been able to keep up if he was running on the ground. She ran for 10, maybe 20 minutes through the underbrush before coming to a clearing, skidding to a halt in the last line of trees before looking over the clear expanse. She knew her fellow knight was here. Aayla had been friends with a younger woman since they were both Padawans in the temple and had memorized her signature in the force. Naruto dropped down beside her as Aayla leaned forward, put her hands on her knees, and took several breaths. Beerus stood several meters ahead of a small line of regular clone troopers, the huge hulking form of an AD-RT slowly advancing through the wilderness. At the young knight's feet was the sparkling wreckage of a dozen battle droids, her green-bladed lightsaber lit and held in her right hand. She smiled. Maybe it was an isolated incident after all. Why would their own soldiers turn on them for no reason? She raised her hand and started to wave to her friend, calling out her name to get her attention, Beerus. The woman turned, dark eyes studying the expansive forest. Beerus saw her, smiled, and made to move towards her. Naruto caught a round face of tanned skin, dark markings on her cheeks, and the bridge of her nose. Her hair was black and shoulder length. He mused for a moment if all women in the GD order were beautiful. It happened in a blur. One moment her friend was walking towards her, closing down her lightsaber. The next she disappeared in an explosion of flame, her body encompassed by wildfire as the main gun of the AD-RT fired on her. Aayla looked on, eyes wide in horror as her friend's life vanished from the force. "No," she whispered, taking a step back and stumbling. Naruto looked on with the same horror as the Twi'lek GD beside him. The sound of a snap, followed by a hiss, brought his attention back to the real world, and he saw Aayla with an ignited lightsaber in her hand and anger in her eyes. The line of soldiers saw them and opened fire with their weapons, pelting the tree line with a storm of crimson lances. The gun on the back of the four-legged artillery tank swiveled round in their direction. Naruto acted on instinct. He grabbed Aayla before she charged and ran back into the forest as fast as he could, ignoring the zings of energy which soared past, leaving burn marks on the trees and rocks all around him. Aayla struggled against him at first, but eventually relented and allowed him to drag her away. He ran with Chakra-enhanced speed for a handful of moments and only stopped when he no longer heard the zings and dings of weapons fire. He turned to find himself tackled to the ground, hitting the dirt hard, the breath exploding from his lungs as he was straddled. He heard the continuous hum, felt the harsh heat, and looked at the tip of the GD Knight's lightsaber. Aayla glared menacingly down at him with clouded over eyes, breath coming and going in heated angry pants. Her voice filtered into his hearing, harsh yet hoarse. "Why did you stop me?" Naruto fought for breath as he spoke, azure eyes not leaving her violent chocolate. "If you ran out there then you would have been as good as dead. I would have handled it." She roared angrily. "No you wouldn't," he shouted back, taking in a last gulp of air before continuing. "You would have been gunned down just like Beerus was." They heard voices coming from the direction they came and knew that the company of troopers were giving chase through the forest. Aayla jumped up, lightsaber ready to fight, but Naruto jumped up with her, grabbing her shoulder and making her look into his eyes. There was a storm of emotion brewing in those dark orbs, pain, disbelief, anger, and betrayal, and it threatened to tear her apart. "You can't fight them," he said, voice soft yet carrying a hint of steel behind it. "If you go against them the way you are now then you will die. You will take a fair lot of them with you, but you will die, and then who will be left who knows the truth? Do you think Beerus would want you to rush off to your own death like this?" She glared at him for a handful of heartbeats before violently shaking her head. She was right there. Her voice was a whisper, but when she looked at him again all the betrayal and anger was replaced with grief. Her friend had been incinerated right before her eyes. She was right in front of me, and I couldn't do a thing about it. Her head darted to the right suddenly, the Padawans. Naruto knew from his discussion with her that Padawans were considered apprentices within the ranks of the GD and caught her attention before she went running into the forests again. The turncoats were still a good way away from them. "Where are they?" Her head snapped round to look at him and taking a deep breath to calm herself Aayla spoke. "They were leading a company to a separatist communications outpost, some 5 clicks to the east." Naruto nodded and offered a brave smile. "Let's go get them then." She nodded and the two took off into the jungle at near superhuman speeds. Aayla gathered the force to blur through the underbrush while Naruto jumped to the treetops in a chakra-propelled leap and began skipping from branch to branch to keep up with her. They left the advancing line of soldiers behind with minimal effort. GD and Shinobi ran through the forest at high speed, not stopping or faltering for the entire journey to their destination. Naruto was the first to see the outpost, a large structure of dark metal reaching up through the forest. A large dish of some description rested on the flat roof, reaching up to the sky. It was embedded in an outcropping of rock, the only entrance being a set of doors in the middle of a clearing. He came to a stop on the second last line of trees, Aayla landing beside him, and together the two watched the activity below. There were at least 30 clone troopers in the clearing. 20 were scouring around, picking up the remains of separatist battle droids and throwing them into a pile in the center of the clearing. Another 10 were standing in a line at attention before the entrance of the communications outpost. It looked like a deadly number of soldiers for only 2 combatants. Aayla didn't think so. She jumped from the branch, lightsaber activating in her hands as she flew through the air. She had easily jumped 20, maybe 30 meters across the clearing. She brought her lightsaber down as she fell and cleaved a clone in half. She then spun around, a second lightsaber igniting in her free hand as she danced and spun, striking down clone after clone with lethal accuracy. 6 of the 9 guards had fallen to her blades before the other 20 realized what was going on, and the last 3 were taken down as they went for their weapons. It was just as the first raised them for the GD that a voice echoed through the air, "Taj Kage Bunshin no Jutsu." The 20 troopers turned to the noise just in time to see a huge cloud of smoke descend on the entire northern line of trees, and exploding through the smog were hundreds of Narutos, all running towards the surprise clone troopers, katana and kunai drawn like a horde of warriors from the ancient stories. Aayla barely gave it a glance, all she cared about was getting to the Padawans before the clones did. The GD Knights stood before the sealed doors, and with the force forced them open with a snap as locks were broken, and a mechanical whine as the blast doors were pushed aside. She walked into the main chamber of the outpost, and was immediately forced to deflect blaster bolts, as a squad of 9 clone troopers opened fire. Aayla did not hesitate. She spun her twin lightsabers, one blue the other green in a protective veil in front of her, deflecting every bolt and dispatching the clones with quick precise strikes. She walked calmly yet cautiously, the darkened corridors illuminated by the dim multicolored light emitted from her lightsabers. Another squad of clones rounded the corner, 3 falling on their knees and aiming their blasters while the other 3 stood behind them, creating 2 lines of blaster rifles. Aayla reached out with the force and sent the entire squad sprawling with a telekinetic push. The first line of 3 slammed into the second, sending all 6 slamming into the durasteel wall. The 3 behind hit the wall with a crack before they were flattened by the first line. The first line stumbled forward in a daze, only to be cut down by her 2 lightsabers. She broke off into a run as she rounded the corner, blade spinning as she cut down another clone, then another, and another as she ran. By the time she reached the main comm chamber, she had left a trail of dead and dying clone troopers in her wake. She entered without hesitation and looked at the carnage within. Score marks covered the walls, and the intense smell of ozone was ripe in the air. The first Padawan she saw was Ekria, lying against the main communications console, blaster burns on her back. The computer slicer must have been seated on the comm console when the clones burst in and shot her. The other 2, Zonder and Barris's own apprentice Drake Logan, looked like they made a better fight of it. Zonder lay face down on the floor, the bodies of 3 clones surrounding him. The Solonian was slumped against the wall, chest burned through with first-degree burns, lightsaber just out of his reach. They were dead, all 3 of them. Aayla stumbled back as she surveyed their bodies, suddenly wishing that this was all a bad dream. Barris wasn't dead, the Padawans weren't dead. The world wasn't falling apart around her. This was all a nightmare she would wake up from. She heard the stomping of footfalls and spun around to see Gal firing his blaster. She tried to move, but was too late as the crimson bolt struck her in the stomach. Aayla hissed in pain, smelling the burning of her flesh as the momentum sent her spinning around before hitting the floor hard, lightsabers flying from her grasp. She gripped the burning flesh of her abdomen, gritting her teeth against the pain. Aayla looked up to see the clone commander towering over her, a blaster pistol drawn and aimed for her head. She looked up at him, eyes full of a mass of emotions. She knew it was futile, but she did it anyway. Her voice was on the verge of breaking as she looked at the emotionless helmet of a man she would have trusted her life with. "Why?" The clone spoke, voice distorted by his helmet speaker. "Nothing personal, General, just orders." Suddenly Naruto was there, grabbing the commander's arm and pulling him around to face him. The blonde glared at the wide-armored soldier before slamming a ball of condensed, spiraling blue energy into his abdomen. Aayla looked at the energy, and besides her pain she couldn't believe her eyes. It was the Force-given substance, the boy's own interior reserves of energy feeding the attack. Rasengan, the armor struck by the ball cracked and caved in, and an explosion of spiraling wind threw Gal back against the far wall of the chamber, slamming into it with enough force to leave a crater in the durasteel. The power behind it was enough to break bones and sever cartilage, yet the commander was dragging himself slowly to his feet. Naruto didn't miss a beat, walking towards the clone, drawing his katana and ending his opponent's life in a quick swing, severing Gal's head from his shoulders. The blonde flicked his blade, sending blood spattering across the pristine floor before sheathing it in a smooth motion. He was at her side in a heartbeat, quickly wrapping his arms around her and lifting her off the floor. "We need to go now." He knew she had lost consciousness when he rushed out the door and down the corridor, ignoring the crumpled bodies of soldiers that littered the floor. The blonde knew more would be coming. He didn't know how he knew, but deep down he knew. Naruto also knew, deep down, that he would not be able to outrun them at his current speed. He had used up a great deal of his chakra when he called up an army of hundreds of Kage Bunshin, add to that him traveling across nearly 50 kilometers worth of terrain, forming a Rasengan, and fighting off a small army of enemy soldiers he was nearly spent. There were 2 abilities in his arsenal that he could use. One was to call upon the powers of his tenant. He had fully mastered the fox's chakra thanks to his mother, God bless her soul. The other was to call upon his sage mode, but that would tax his chakra to the point of exhaustion. Fox's chakra is then. He called upon it. The warmth started in his belly and then exploded out across his entire body. Within moments he was encompassed by his fully formed cloak of electric blue energy, black runes, and seals appearing along his arms and chest. The cloak flared as he took off in a blur of speed, flying down the corridors with the only sign of his passage being a yellow flash. He exploded from the entrance and vanished into the trees at speeds no human being could possibly match. To the assembling clone troopers, all they saw was a blur of crimson shoot past them, followed by a mass of dust which blinded their vision. To Naruto, the trees blurred by him, becoming nothing more than an almost inconceivable mass of merging colors. He didn't know how long he kept running until he felt the life in his arms begin to dim. He looked down to see the woman terribly pale, blood dribbling from the sides of her mouth from internal bleeding. She was dying. He skidded to a halt and willed the cloak of demonic energy to recede. Gently he set her down on the ground and immediately brought his hands together over the burn, ignoring her whimper of pain. He concentrated the chakra like he was taught and his hand slowly took on a soothing green glow. What he saw worried him. It wasn't just the first-degree burns on her skin, but her organs, primarily her stomach and kidneys, were also badly burned and bleeding another inch and they would have been liquidized. What kind of weapon could do such a thing? Come on, don't you dare die on me. You promised you'd help me get back, didn't you? He poured his healing chakra into the wounds and found that even though they were healing, it would be too little too late to save her. Naruto grit his teeth. No matter how hard he tried, everyone who tried to help him died. Sakura, Hinata, Kakashi, Tsunade, Kurabi, Shikamaru, Kiba, Niji, Yamato, to name a few. The list went on. They all died and he was powerless. Now here was a woman who had found him in the middle of an alien forest, who kept him calm and promised to help him, and here she was, dying in his arms, and he was powerless. There was only one option. Okay, concentrate my chakra, direct it to where it's needed the most. The warm light slowly spread across his arms, through his hands, and into Ayla's wound. He watched with a grim determination as instead of harming her further it began to heal. The horrific burns on her kidneys and stomach lessened, blood vessels reattached, the bleeding stopped. He felt the light which was her life slowly brighten again. Quickly he picked Aayla off the ground and, cradling her in his arms, began running through the forest again, away from the army that wanted to kill her, and by extension him. He rushed through the forests, trying to ignore the blaster bolts as they zoomed past him, impacting all around him. The GD grimaced. He had been running for hours. The clones had turned on them, betrayed them. He had felt Master Unduli die, had felt countless GD across the galaxy die. He had felt his apprentice vanish through the force. Avenge Aayla, mourn Aayla. The blaster bolt struck the tree bark beside him, barely a few inches from his head. His pursuers had not relented. He had been able to whittle down their numbers with traps, but they continued on. He should not be surprised. These were ARC troopers, the elite commando forces of the Grand Army of the Republic. Now only one remained, one last ARC trooper. If only he had more strength he could take him, but he was hurting. The blast which should have killed him didn't, instead leaving him badly burned but still alive, and still mobile. He jumped high, landing on a tree branch and fading into the shadows. Watching as his last living pursuer came within his vision. The captain of the unit was sent to eliminate him. Aims over GD, he called over the silence, show yourself and die quick and painless, or I call in an airstrike, and not just you but the village nearby will all die. It's your call. He cursed, disbelieving that he had ever trusted this man. He could probably escape, but the Wookiee population would be massacred. He made his decision and withdrew his lightsaber. The clone was within range, just one more step. With a roar he ignited his lightsaber and jumped. The commander looked up and, raising his blaster, fired. Aayla woke with a start, sitting up and wincing at the pain. She was breathing heavily, exposed skin covered in sweat. The knight placed a hand against her chest and took several deep calming breaths to bring herself under control. After one last breath she looked around, seeing that she was inside some kind of tent. Her abdomen had been bandaged and her lightsabers were set in a corner nearby. She looked around in confusion before her memories caught up with her. Barris vanished in a ball of fire, Ekria and her fellow Padawans massacred by their own troopers, herself turned on by the ARC troopers sent to retrieve her. She grasped onto her knees and laid her chin against them, a single tear running down her cheek. This was not an isolated incident. Somehow she knew it in her heart. Suddenly the galaxy felt like a darker place. You're awake. She looked up to see a familiar head of blonde hair and was relieved when she saw Naruto poking his head through the opening to the outside. He smiled, thanked the sage. You were touched and went for a while. Naruto, she said his name with a little relief. Where are we? Deep within the forests, the blonde replied, I must have run for hours. Don't worry, we're at least 100 kilometers from the battle site. I doubt they look this far. She realized that she was not within a tent, but a hollowed-out tree, just like the one she had found him in. How long have I been out? He looked her in the eyes. About 2 days. You really badly hurt, Aayla. It was pure luck that I remembered those silly healing jutsu Granny and Sakura taught me, otherwise you wouldn't have survived. Is that what you call those abilities? She asked. Her memory of what he did slowly returned to her. Naruto, you made over 100 solid copies of yourself, you annihilated an entire company of battle-hardened clone troopers, you created a solid attack of force energy without calling upon the dark side. What are you? He had the gall to look sheepish. You took out a third of their number yourself, so I couldn't take all the credit. As for the clones, it was more like 200, but hey, who's counting? And that ball of energy is a pretty well-known attack for people in my line of work. And who are people of your line of work? She asked incredulously. He laughed without humor at people who were ruthlessly destroying themselves. Come out when you're ready. He hopped through the opening then, leaving the young GD alone with her thoughts. She once again leaned against a bark, drawing her legs up and resting her head against her knees. This was not an isolated incident. When she was fighting against the clones, she had felt more than just Barris's death, hers was just the closest. There were other deaths, lives of people she knew, fellow GD, their familiar auras winking out one at a time. The death she felt, the lives that winked from existence, hit her like a slap to the face, again and again and again. Every death of a friend, of a loved one had hit her, and when she had reached the outpost, saw the clones, and thought of the Padawan, she snapped. She had seen red when she jumped from the tree branch, lightsaber igniting. She had roared a guttural shriek full of the burning emotions of betrayal, pain, and grief. At that moment, as she hit the ground and cut down clone troopers left and right, she had touched the dark side, gave into her emotions, and just let her lightsabers fly. She didn't stop. Every blur of white armor was mercilessly cut down as she searched through the communications building for the 3 teenage Padawans. When she found them, saw their bodies lying lifelessly on the ground, burned by blaster bolts, and eyes lifeless to the world. In that moment, she had been ruthlessly flung back into reality, regaining her mind from the dark swirl of emotions. She had stared in horror at their bodies and turned around to see Gal shoot her in the belly. Questions flew through her mind. Why would they do this? The clones and GD had fought side by side for 3 years. They had fought together, bled together, and died together. She had considered Bly, Gal, and the other officers of the Star Corps to be her comrades, her friends, and they had all just turned and tried to kill her. Nothing personal, General, just orders. Gal said that just after he shot her in the stomach and towered over her, pistol pressed against her temple, ready to finish the job. Order? What kind of order would make the troopers turn on her? What could be happening back on Coruscant for such an order to be given? She knew the High Council was planning to confront the Chancellor to relinquish his powers if Master Kenobi defeated General Grievous on Utapau. Aayla knew the GD Master and knew he was more than capable of taking the cyborg monster down. Slowly, Aayla stood on wobbly legs and almost staggered through the opening to the outside. Naruto sat near a small campfire, cooking some kind of reptile on a makeshift spit of metal. She mused on where he got the cooking utensils, but found herself unable to ask. She staggered over and fell into a sitting position across from him, her eyes on the ground. The wooden stake, pierced with a slab of meat, was presented before her, and she eyed it for a moment before looking up. Naruto stood over her, a worried frown on his face as he held out the food. You need to eat something, Aayla. You haven't eaten anything in 2 days. She nodded absently, fingers closing around the stick. She whispered thanks in a hoarse whisper before taking a small tentative bite of her meal. Naruto sat down beside her as she finished. I need to check your wound. She allowed his hands to slowly unravel the bandages around her stomach, wincing in pain as the burn mark stuck against the last of the bandages. He discarded the roll, and she noticed dried blood on the white cloth. Lie down for me. She complied without question and watched as he inspected the blackened skin of the blaster burn, now a couple of days old. He gently pressed his fingers against the skin, asking her where it hurt. For a second, Aayla felt like a child, but she visibly relaxed under his soft voice, soothing to her. Her stomach still hurt, but not as badly as she thought. Hold still, Naruto ordered softly, placing his hands against her burnt skin. Aayla looked on, confused only for her eyes to widen as his hands were encompassed by a soft green glow. It felt like he had placed a warm balm on her burn, and the pain receded further. She looked at his face to see it as a mask of concentration, eyes focused with such intensity that she felt her cheeks darken. Finally, he took a deep breath and removed his hands. I was right. You did take a bad hit. Your stomach and kidneys have been badly burned. I was able to heal most of it, but you won't be able to do anything too strenuous for a while. He asked her to sit up and quickly replaced the bandages around her stomach. After he was finished, the two of them sat in a companionable silence. It was night, Aayla realized, and a canopy of some kind had been placed over the campfire. As the silence resumed, Aayla kept remembering what had happened barely a few days before. She shouldn't feel this way. She had seen many friends and comrades die in this awful war. What made this so different? It wasn't the first friend she saw incinerated by an artillery bolt or the first time she witnessed her fellow GD lying dead on the ground. What changed? Who killed them was what changed. They weren't killed by Sith, Dark GD, or the armies of the Separatist Confederacy. They were killed by their own clone troopers. They had turned around and stabbed them all in the back. Dark emotions from before threatened to resurface: betrayal, anger, pain, sorrow, and pure unadulterated grief. She took a deep, shuddering breath and brutally slammed it all down. "You know you can let it out," Naruto's voice roused her, and her head darted in his direction. "It's not good for your health to keep things bottled up. Believe me, I've been there quite a few times." She was surprised by the quivering in her voice and gritted her teeth, angry at herself. She shouldn't be breaking down like this. She was a GD Knight, damn it. "I don't know what you mean." He reached over and gently brushed his finger over the skin below her left eye, leaning back to show her the water dripping from his fingertip. Aayla reached up to her face and found warm, salty water flowing down her cheeks. She was crying. It was then that she came to a realization. This was not a bad dream. This was not an isolated incident. She knew it in her very soul. At that moment, Aayla had never felt so alone in her life. Aayla couldn't hold it in anymore. The tears fell without resistance. She was alone, all alone. Arms enveloped her, and before she knew it, she was brought forward into a full embrace, a chin leaning against the top of her head. She was just able to make out Naruto's voice. "It's okay, just let it out." And she did. She buried her face into his chest and released a string of heavy, emotion-filled sobs which racked her body and stained the blonde shirt. She cried for a long time, but as time went on, her cries of sorrow became mild sobs, then sniffles and whimpers, followed by the sound of light breathing. She had cried herself to sleep. How long she was like this she didn't know, but when she woke up she found that she was still in Naruto's arms, his powerful azure eyes conveying to her his worry. How long was I out? About an hour. She felt her cheeks burn and released herself from his embrace. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean Naruto, thank you." "You're welcome, Aayla," he said with a smile before looking over at the campfire, the flames extinguished. Meat cold." She looked at him for a moment before a small smile of her own curled her dark blue lips. She may have been betrayed, she may be the last GD alive, but she did not fear it as much as before, because this man was with her. "Can I ask you a question?" "Sure." "While we were fighting the clones, I saw you perform techniques and abilities which I have never seen before, and to be honest, some of the things you did terrified me. How are you able to do it? How can you create balls of energy with your hands? How can you create a small army of copies?" She looked him in the eyes, her voice showing no fear or hesitation. He was amazed she seemed so strong only an hour after she broke down. "Naruto, what are you?" Naruto smiled widely. "Do you want to learn how to do the things I do? I promise it will be an enlightening experience." Aayla could not believe it. He was willing to share what he knew with her. They had only known each other for a day, and when she was in her time of need he had been there for her, protected her, and saved her life at least 3 times since they had met. Why did he go so out of his way for her, a total stranger? "Why would you do all of this for me?" Naruto smiled a genuine smile. "Because when you woke me up I thought I was looking up at an angel. I still do. You're a good person, Aayla. You only do what you do for the better of those around you, and you did not deserve such a fate." She blushed at his words. How could she not? He had just said that he considered her an angel. She was unaware as he rose to his feet and offered her his hand. "You promised me you'd help me find my way back home, didn't you? Call me a chauvinist, but that showed me who you are, and it makes me want to protect you. I'll teach you how I move, how I fight, and in return you help me find a way home. What do you say?" Her blush strengthened as she took his hand. Lai watched on as the Chancellor's form came into existence, barely 20 centimeters tall, yet held with such authority that it was impossible to deny him. "Report on your progress, Commander." Lai straightened as he reported. "We were able to kill GD Knight Barisafi, as well as the 3 Padawan learners. However, the fate of GD Knight Aayla Secura is unknown. We know she was shot in the stomach, but we're unable to determine whether she is dead or not." The Chancellor stared at him, and even though his cowl was raised to cover his face, the commander knew it was not a look of satisfaction. "Explain." Lai complied. Clone Commander Gal faced off against General Sakura and was able to shoot her in the abdomen. Before he could finish the job, he was attacked and killed by an unknown assailant. The man was able to escape with her in full view of a company of troopers. The 20 centimeters tall form seemed to think for a moment before he raised his head. "Commander Bly, you are to continue to hunt down GD Knight Aayla Secura until you present her body to me. I will be sending a unit of the Inquisitorius to help you in your investigation. Spare no expense, level the forest if you have to, but find her." Bly bowed. "It will be done mildly." Victory, the war is over. It is learned today that the separatist leaders of the Confederation of Independent Systems have been found by an elite unit of our own Galactic Republic Advanced Recon Troopers. It is reported that despite repeated attempts to reach a peaceful settlement, the separatist leadership fought to the last. But the death of the Separatist Council, as well as the deaths of Supreme Commander Dooku and General Grievous, the head of the Separatist Dragon, has been severed. The war is over. Second assassination attempt of beloved Emperor. It is reported that another GD attempt has been made against our Supreme Chancellor, now First Galactic Emperor, Dantius Palpatine. The assassin, revealed to be the Grand GD Master himself, infiltrated the Senate building, killed several members of Senate security, and caused massive destruction to the Great Meeting Chamber. However, before he could deliver the final blow, our beloved Emperor was saved by a small unit of elite ARC troopers. Grand GD Master Yoda was able to escape and is currently still at large. It is another example of the corruption and devious methods of the power-hungry GD Order. The bounty of 500,000 Imperial credits has been offered to anyone who can capture the traitorous Grand Master, dead or alive. It was a surreal experience to be in the shoes of a teacher. It was even more surreal to be teaching a woman who was at least 3 years his senior and was fully capable of sending him flying with a thought. Yet here he was, sitting cross-legged on the forest floor, looking at the beautiful form of Aayla Secura, who likewise was seated cross-legged right in front of him. He was teaching her for many reasons, the most of which was that he knew she needed something to get her mind off what had happened to her over the last week. Being betrayed by your comrades, seeing your friends die, it was something that left a hole in you. He knew this all too well. Right, so let's get started. The first thing I am going to have to do is check to see if you have a chakra circulatory system, he said with a slightly nervous smile, reaching out with his hand. Aayla blinked before taking his in hers, marveling at how large his calloused hand was compared to her slender one. He pumped a little of his chakra through his arm and into her. It was like someone had hit a light switch to a power grid not used in years. The natural reserves in her body flickered before flowing through the massive chakra pathways, activating what had laid dormant for all of her life. Aayla gasped, feeling her own energy increase tenfold and flow through her just like the Force did. Was the first thing that left Naruto's mouth as he gently opened all 361 of her points, allowing the chakra to continue its flow. Your chakra coils are average, but your pathways are solid and healthy. I think you will be able to manipulate and use chakra with no problem. She nodded, but found that she had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. Naruto seemed to catch on, for as he released his hold he looked into her eyes and smiled. Want me to explain? It would help, she relented. Okay, where to start? He thought about it for a moment before taking a deep breath. Chakra is a form of energy which all living individuals naturally produce to some degree. It is a mixture of the physical energy present in every cell of the body and the spiritual energy gained from exercise and experience. Once mixed, it can be channeled through the chakra circulatory system, which is to chakra as the regular circulatory system is to blood, to any of the 361 chakra points called in the body. With me so far? I think so, Aayla replied with a nod. It sounded an awful lot like the Force, but instead of it being an energy field which surrounded all life, it appeared to be a reservoir of energy from within oneself. Through various methods, the most common of which would be hand seals, the chakra in the body could be manipulated to create an effect which would not be possible otherwise, such as walking on water and wow, hold on a minute. Aayla said suddenly, gaining a frown from the blonde. Did you just say walking on water? Naruto looked at her for a moment, blinked once or twice, and then broke out in a wide grin. You guys don't know how to walk on water? Aayla stared at him incredulously for a moment and then dumbly shook her head. Naruto's grin did the impossible when it widened further. I don't believe you. It's considered a basic chakra control exercise along with tree climbing. Aayla looked ever so slightly agitated. Well, excuse me if we can't perform miracles. The blonde raised his hands in surrender. Sorry, I forget where I am sometimes. Tell you what, I'll show you the exercises I'm talking about. If you want to control your chakra, you're going to have to learn these 2 techniques. Aayla sighed, rubbing her forehead with a hand before nodding. Naruto, still grinning like a fool, rose to his feet and walked across the clearing to one of the towering mushroom-shaped trees of the Felucian forest. He looked up at the long branchless trunk and grumbled something before bringing his hands together in a hand seal, explaining to her in a clear voice as he went. For beginners, it's usually easier to concentrate your chakra through hand seals, so I'll show it to you. Aayla complied, her annoyance forgotten and replaced by curiosity. She stood up and walked beside her teacher, taking close note of the way his hands formed a strange seal. She felt a surge of energy at the soles of his feet and watched with ever-rising curiosity as Naruto stepped forward, placed his right foot against a bark, and began to walk. He walked vertically up a tree without needing anything to hold him in place. She gasped in surprise, he was basically defying gravity. Sure, she could do it too, but in the form of force-augmented jumps and dives, not physically walking up vertical surfaces. Her surprise lengthened when he reached a mushroom-shaped chute and kept going, now standing upside down right above her. He looked down with a sheepish smile, "With me so far?" She nodded dumbly and immediately berated herself at being so mystified with what Naruto had called a basic training exercise. His grin widened as he spoke. "First I will teach you the 12 basic hand seals needed to channel chakra into jutsu, then when I'm sure you know them I will teach you the basic ninjutsu and jinjutsu that we're taught at the academy back home. I considered teaching you taijutsu, but I'm guessing you already know an assortment of fighting styles." It took Aayla a while to catch on to what he was saying, but she was never the sort of person to shy away from asking a question. "I'm sorry. What are ninjutsu, jinjutsu, and taijutsu?" He blinked before offering her an apologetic smile. "Sorry, I keep forgetting I'm not at home anymore." Taijutsu translates as the physical arts. It's basically martial arts and fighting styles. Jinjutsu stands for illusionary techniques. That's the ability to create illusions on yourself or against your opponent. Finally there's ninjutsu, my favorite, which creates all of the really cool techniques, including elemental and clone jutsu. Aayla nodded, absently feeling her neck muscles protest at her looking up for so long. Naruto chose that moment to release his technique, performing a flawless somersault as he fell and landing in a crouch right beside her. He sat down and she mimicked his movements, listening intently to what he was saying. "There are 12 basic hand seals to learn, but once you know them well enough the sky's the limit. I will begin by teaching you these seals." His hands came together to make each seal as he introduced them and she watched intently. The 12 seals are bird, boar, dog, dragon, ox, tiger, serpent, rat, horse, monkey, hare and ram. Usually it takes an academy student months or even years to perfect these seals, but I'm confident I can have you commit them to muscle memory within 3 months. There's a chance we'll be found sooner. Aayla told him, "They have air units here as well as ground." "Air?" Naruto asked with a frown, before he looked at her in complete confusion. "You mean they can fly?" Aayla raised a delicate eyebrow. "How else do you think the Republic spans over 100,000 worlds? Don't forget you're talking to me, a guy whose people's idea of a technological marvel is the invention of the telephone." Naruto said dubiously, "By the sage, I'm way out of my depth here." Aayla smiled coyly, "Good thing you have me then." Naruto chuckled to himself, "Yeah, a beautiful tour guide. A guy could do much worse." She blushed slightly at the compliment, but forced it down and berated herself for beginning to feel the way she did. It was a core rule of the GD order that any kind of emotional attachment was forbidden. It was a central rule of the order to stop them from feeling negative emotions which came with feeling for someone. She realized that she had not uttered a word to him and he was looking at her with a slightly nervous expression. "Aayla, are you ready to start or what?" "Oh," she started, before shaking her head. "Yeah, let's begin." And begin they did. Naruto began slowly, spending 3 hours making her go through the basic 12 hand seals to the point where her hands and fingers hurt from the continuous movements. He spent the rest of the day going through the basics of ninjutsu. According to him there were 3 basics that all beginner shinobi needed to learn. Those 3 were the Bunshin no Jutsu, or clone technique, the Henge no Jutsu, or transformation, and the Kawarimi no Jutsu, or body replacement. The Bunshin was a more basic form of Naruto's signature technique, what he called the Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, or shadow clone, and was a mostly jinjutsu-oriented technique. It allowed the user to create an exact replica of the wielder, illusions which could be used to spring traps or impersonate opponents. Aayla quickly learned that these were not like the ones Naruto used. While his were solid copies, these were simply illusions, and if looked at closely enough, one could distinguish them by the lack of any changes to the environment around them, like kicking up dust or crushing grass. The henge was simply a technique which could transform someone into either an object or in a more advanced form into the appearance of someone else, another jinjutsu-oriented jutsu designed mainly for stealth and spying. Aayla found this to be one of the most interesting of the 3 and considered that if the GD knew this technique, then so many of their operatives within the separatists would have been saved. Finally there was the Kawarimi, which was the most interesting of the 3 in that it allowed the user to change places with another nearby object, like a piece of debris, an animal or even, to her surprise, another person. She was surprised and slightly hesitant to believe that it was a type of time and space manipulation jutsu capable of bending reality around someone to make the switch. Naruto had explained to her that there were other, more advanced forms of this technique and that all were useful or deadly against opponents. At night they hunted, cooked, and ate what they could, and during this first of many sessions she learned a great deal about the young man, his people, his culture, his civilization's hierarchy, and most important to her was that she learned more about him as a person. He had a harsh life, both of his parents were killed by a creature called the Kyuubi when he was born, and he had lived most of his young life as an orphan, scrounging around and living as best he could. In return, Aayla told him about herself, as well as everything about the order she was a part of. She told him about her time as an apprentice under GD Master Quinlan Vos, the places she had been to, and the people she had met. Then she told him about the war and how the GD had been changed from peacekeepers and mediators into soldiers and officers. Why were the GD forced to become soldiers? Naruto asked with a confused look. Didn't this republic have an army of its own? Aayla shook her head. The Galactic Republic hadn't needed one until now. We had been enjoying peace for over 1,000 years, and during that time the army was downsized again and again until there was nothing more than a small judiciary force. The individual member states were left to govern their own defense. Sure, small conflicts cropped up every now and then, but when that happened we were usually called to settle them. So when these separatists appeared with mass armies of these droids, there were no battle-hardened soldiers to meet them, and considering the GD were the only ones with combat experience, they were asked to become commanding officers. Naruto surmised, taking a bite of his meat as he spoke. Is that about right? Aayla nodded her head. That's right. There was no time to gather and train a traditional army, so we were asked to lead a new army that the Republic had secretly been assembling, an army of clones. Hold on, Naruto cut in lightly. If the Republic knew this war was going to break out, why did they create a clone army? Why didn't they just assemble an army of volunteers to meet them? Training an army of the size needed was impossible. It would have taken far too long, and by the time such an army was ready the separatists would have won. Aayla explained, the clones could be grown and made combat ready in a quarter of the time it would have taken us to train regular soldiers. Naruto nodded, absently finishing off his meat. 2 weeks later, CC 5052 or Clone Marshal Commander Bly stood at perfect attention as he watched the Theta-class shuttle slowly descend upon the makeshift landing pad. The ship's 2 large wings folded up around her as her stubby landing struts hit the metal with an audible thump, and almost immediately the landing ramp located in the rear opened with a hiss of hydraulics. Bly, flanked by 2 battle-hardened ARC troopers, watched with a mixture of horror and fascination as the Emperor's agent walked down the ramp. He was a tall and imposing figure, hooded and cloaked in maroon robes. As the man walked down the ramp of the shuttle, Bly could just make out the glint of dull gray armor and a black cylindrical hilt of a lightsaber latched to his belt. Flanking him were no less than 4 members of the Republic's elite Senate Guard or Red Guard, dressed in their crimson robes and bullet-shaped helms, force pikes against their shoulders. His voice broke through the commander's reverie. Report, Commander. Bly stood solidly to attention, snapping a salute as he reported on his progress. We have confirmed the deaths of GD Knight Borisov E, as well as the 3 Padawans. However, we were unable to find the body of GD Knight Aayla Secura. The Inquisitor began walking across the pad, past Bly and his 2 ARC guards, and down the main ramp to solid ground. The entirety of the 327th Star Corps had assembled just outside of Felucia's main settlement of Quaitio. Huge swaths of forest had been felled to make way for the army. The main fortress of former Commerce Guild President Shumai is nothing more than a burning ruin, smoke billowing into the skies just a couple of kilometers away. The separatist presence on the planet had been thoroughly purged. All 10,000 battle droids and their mechanized units had been destroyed down to the last scrap of metal. The newcomer walked through the ranks of men and machines as the marshal followed, continuing to give his report. I have sent out a full brigade in search of her, as well as a squadron of lots to continue searching from the air. So far, Senior Commander Adin has reported no sign of her and is requesting additional units to help with the search. Order the Senior Commander to pull his brigade back here. You and your corps are being reassigned. Bly blinked before frowning. Sir, we haven't completed our mission here. Not just in our failure to completely carry out Order 66, but we haven't been able to nullify the contagion the Seps have placed in the water supply. That is no longer your concern, Commander, the maroon-robed figure rebuked. Your corps are to pack up and prepare for redeployment. You on the other hand will remain, along with the men on this list. Bly looked down at the datapad the Inquisitor held out to him, took it, and began scanning through the list of names. The list of individuals included himself and several individuals from the Star Corps ARC Trooper contingents. The best of the corps he saw, many of whom were trained by the general herself. The marshal looked up at the Inquisitor questioningly, and after a moment he spoke. Begging your pardon, sir, but what is this about? You, and the men on that list, have been reassigned to the 501st Legion under the command of the new Supreme Commander of Imperial Forces, Lord Vader. This statement made Bly look at the names again. The 501st were considered the elite of the Grand Army, the best of the best. It was an honor to be reassigned to this force. I will also require you to list a battalion's worth of your best clone troopers to remain here with me. Ones who are not on that list. The water was cool and crisp, cleansing her of all her aches and pains as she dived into the crystal-clear lagoon, sending splashes and ripples across the otherwise calm and still lake. It was a stroke of luck that they camped nearby, one of only a few pools of water which was predator-free. which just 2 weeks before she thought was impossible. The moment passed before Aayla exploded from the depths, taking a deep gulp of air before she fell back. She took a deep, cleansing breath, enjoying the feeling of the water bathing her naked form, caressing her skin in chilly tendrils, droplets running across her tender cerulean flesh in rivulets. She laid back and let herself float, arms and legs stretched, looking up at the Felucian sky. Her leather clothes lay on the shore, hung over a low-lying branch to dry after she had washed them. It would take an hour or two for them to dry under the Felucian sun, and she wanted to wash the dirt and grime from herself while she waited. Aayla didn't worry about being caught. Naruto was at least a kilometer away hunting for their next meal. The Felucian jungle was full of edible things including plants and animals, so there was no real worry about keeping themselves fed, and with his skills catching prey was as simple as breathing, but it would take him an hour or two at least to find what they needed. She owed Naruto so much, and she doubted she could ever repay him. The blonde-haired shinobi had saved her life at least 3 times, and had taken care of her when she was hurt and vulnerable, nursing her back to health when if she was alone, she would have surely perished. More still, he had willingly shared the basic knowledge of his people with her, someone he had just met, and she was thankful to him in his efforts to teach her. She never knew she had her own personal reservoir of power, something she could now call upon and manipulate at will. He had taught her the 12 basic seals that aided in the drawing of this power with great care and an abundance of patience. He was a great teacher, despite him thinking otherwise, and her progress had only solidified that. He had taught her the 3 basic jutsu, as well as showing her the 2 basic exercises to harness and control her chakra. Aayla had already mastered the tree climbing exercise and was well on her way to walking on water. She giggled at the memory of slowly walking across the water in the same manner one would walk a tightrope. Naruto was nearby, sitting at the edge of the lake and offering her pointers when she needed it. She had fallen into that accursed stream more times than she could count, and she was still falling. She was determined, if for no other reason than that the silly oaf had dangled the promise of learning stronger techniques if she proved she could do it. Aayla sighed, realizing she had more fun training with him than she had in a long time. The war seemed to have sucked all of the joy from her life, replacing it with a need to keep her and her troopers alive. How she missed the days when she was a simple apprentice, training with her master and learning new and exciting things every day. She missed those days. She missed Master Vose, Master Tholm, Trauma, and Yoda, whose old sagely voice was better than a glass of warm bantha milk to a child. She missed the younglings at the temple who she played with when she wasn't stuck on a far-off world fighting for her life. Their happy faces and playful laughter assaulted her ears, and she felt a pain in her chest. She would never hear those voices again. Images of Barris vanishing and a ball of fire invaded her mind, of the 3 Padawans lying dead in that communications room, of Gal holding a blaster to her forehead. Aayla felt a tear trace its way down her cheek before she dunked her head under the water's surface. Naruto took a deep breath as he walked towards the small lagoon, absently taking off his jacket and shirt as he walked. The hunt had been fairly simple this time around. Barely a half hour in, and he had managed to catch and kill one of the strange reptilian birds that were common on this world. He already had it over a fire when he left, leaving a cage bunchen to watch over it and make sure it didn't get burned. The blonde had not bathed in almost 3 days, and even he was beginning to notice the stench rising from his clothes. He needed to wash them and then wash all the grime off of himself in order to keep his sanity intact. Naruto didn't know where his comrade was and hoped that Aayla hadn't gotten the same idea as he had. Thinking of Aayla brought many emotions and unanswered questions to the blonde. After living with her for 2 weeks, he thought he was getting to know her quite well, and what he had surmised was that she was a strong and courageous woman, if a little impulsive at times, jumping headfirst into a situation instead of standing back. She kind of reminded him of himself when he was a teenager, only more refined, more calm, and in control, and not the tornado of barely controlled energy he once was. She also possessed a healthy dose of curiosity, listening to every word as he trained her in the basics of a shinobi's abilities. Aayla had proven to be a fast learner, willing to train for hours or even days on end to master a certain technique. He remembered after he showed her the basic hand signs and handed her a scroll on the subject. She spent another 3 hours reading through the parchment and going through the hand seals. He reached the last line of trees and stopped dead in his tracks at what he saw. Aayla walked through the shallows towards the beach, completely naked to the world. Quickly the blonde jumped back and hid behind a tree, quietly berating himself. Of course she would want to take a bath. She hadn't bathed in a while either. He knew he should have just turned his back on the scene, gone back to camp, and watched over the food. But that stupid perverted impulse of his kept him rooted firmly in place and made him turn around and survey the form of perfection before him. Her body consisted of a supple form and flat stomach, pure unblemished cerulean skin which sparkled thanks to the droplets of water clinging to her flesh. Her breasts were a little over a handful, and her legs were long and seemed to stretch for an eternity with every fluid step she took. Those two long head tails followed her, swishing backwards and forwards, touching her firm backside on more than one occasion. In fact, every inch of flesh on her body was firm and toned, showing that she took her physical health very, very seriously. By God, she was a sight to behold. Naruto suddenly gave his head a violent shake before considering smashing it against a tree trunk. He loved that old sage like a father, but damned Jiraiya to hell for turning him into a pervert. He turned, took a deep calming breath, and marched back to camp, unaware that as Aayla reached her now dry clothes her head shot up and darted from left to right, almost like she was looking for something. She reappeared 5 minutes later, fully dressed and drying off her long towel. Naruto sat rigidly in place, shadow clone dispelled, and watched the meat as it darkened. She took several steps closer, eyes closed and features relaxed. I really needed that. Naruto looked up to her, trying desperately to stop the full blush from forming on his cheeks. He apparently failed miserably. "Naruto, are you alright?" Aayla asked with a little worry, kneeling beside him and placing a delicate cerulean hand against his forehead. "Do you have a fever? Your face is all flushed." "Nope," Naruto replied, taking those images and violently flushing them from his thought processes. "Just a little tired is all, and I'm in real need of a bath." She smiled a delicate beautiful smile. "Well, I'm finished bathing, so you can go if you want. I'll keep an eye on the food." Naruto nodded and stood up, trying and failing to not notice the cleavage showing thanks to her leather cut-off top. "Thanks." Aayla stared after him as he disappeared into the forest, a little confused from the change of his aura. When he saw her walk into camp, she felt that he was embarrassed and a little guilty. Why would he need to feel guilty? After a moment, the young knight shrugged and finished drying off her dot. Major Garn looked up as the last wedge-shaped Acclamator-class assault ship disappeared in the surrounding cloud cover over the capital, the 750-meter-long warship transporting 16,000 of his brethren to their next assignment. He had heard that although the separatist leadership was destroyed, there were still worlds refusing to adhere to the new empire's control, and almost half of the Grand Army was being rerouted to deal with them. 6 months later, the lieutenant considered the last Confederate resistance to fall within 6 months. That was not his concern, however, not anymore. His attention was once again fully on this Inquisitor, an agent of the Empire's new Inquisitorius, who he considered was a replacement for the GD. The Inquisitor here was definitely a Force-sensitive individual, but immediately he decided he didn't like him. Something about this man made his hair stand on end, not like Lady Secura or Lady Afi, who had a calming aura about them. He didn't even know the man's name. Arn had been handpicked by his former martial commander to lead the chosen clone squads during his operation. The major found himself in charge of over 500 veteran clone troopers, a battalion's worth task force gathered to help in the hunt for their former general. Several meters away was the intimidating form of a small column of modified AD-RT artillery walkers, given to them to serve as mobile command centers. A further 6 lot gunships lay nestled to his left, already filling up with a platoon of 30 clones each. "Are you listening to Major?" "Yes, Inquisitor," Garn replied, looking over the holographic view of the jungle for at least 50 kilometers in every direction. This section of jungle stretches for at least 300 kilometers in every direction, and with her abilities, Knight Sakura could be well out of range by now. "There is no need to worry about that, Lieutenant," the Inquisitor replied. "If she was injured, she would not be able to run far. She would be looking for an open space, with a water source, and enough cover to hide." The Major thought about it. There were only a select few locations which had water supplies, as it was the middle of the dry season. From atmospheric scans, he knew that there were only 3 small pools of water in this section of jungle, and a stream which was continually shrinking as the weeks passed. "Then I will order the gunships to survey these 3 areas for any sign of her." "See to it that it is done, Major," the Inquisitor replied, turning to make his way towards the open ramp of the AD-RT. "Her survival is a black mark on the 327th Star Corps, making you look like you cannot complete your assignments." The lieutenant grit his teeth at the man's statements. Yes, he was beginning to miss the GD already. If he could, he would rather kill this man instead of his former general. Garn had deep respect for her, as a warrior and a person. He would fulfill his duty, but he didn't have to like it. "That's it," Naruto said with a smile as he watched her. "I think you got it." Aayla breathed a sigh of relief as she put one foot in front of the other, still amazed every time she looked down to see the crystal clear water lapping at her bare feet. She was soaking wet from several failed attempts, her skin glistening in the mid-morning sunlight, but she did it. She was walking on water. A genuinely happy smile curved her lips upward as the young woman looked down at the massive life beneath her feet. She clasped her hands behind her back and leaned down to look at the small shoal of alien fish flitting through the deep water of the pool. At that moment she felt different, happy, and relaxed. Aayla looked up to see Naruto standing before her, a smile of his own adorning his whiskered cheeks. "There you go, Aayla, knew you could do it." She blushed ever so slightly at the compliment before offering him a quick bow, hoping the sudden movement hid the darkening of her cheeks. Sadly, this did not go unnoticed by the blonde human. "Hey, are you blushing?" "No," she replied with as much indignation as she could muster, which wasn't much considering her happy mood. "You're blushing," he exclaimed with a chuckle. Ayla's blush darkened before she felt her control slip and she fell back into the water with a squeak of surprise. Naruto moved quickly, grabbing her by the sides before she went under and pulling her back up to a standing position. Sorry. Concentrate on the soles of your feet. Good, gather your chakra." Aayla regained her footing and sent a dangerous look to her teacher. "That was not funny." "I disagree," Naruto replied with a grin, turning around to walk back to dry land. He managed 3 steps before Aayla jumped him, sending the two of them cascading through the lake surface. A second passed before the young Twi'lek exploded from the water, concentrating her chakra into the soles of her feet to keep herself stably on the surface. She was soaked to the bone again, but surprising her teacher had been worth it. Or so she thought. She waited for a minute before she began to get worried. Naruto hadn't resurfaced, and as she walked in a circle, absently calling out his name and getting no reply, she really started to worry. Aayla was completely unaware of the dark shape, keeping stride with her from beneath her feet, not until a pair of hands exploded from the water and latched onto her bare ankles. The young knight was barely able to squeak in surprise before she was pulled down, losing control of her chakra. Both resurfaced at the same time, only their heads visible. Naruto shook his head violently, tossing a mass of droplets from his hair in every direction, including on his bemused student. Aayla frowned at him before a rueful smile curved her dark lips, a smile which the blonde returned. Both concentrated their chakra into the palms of their hands and the soles of their feet, forcing themselves out of the water and into a kneeling stance. Both looked at each other for a heartbeat before the young woman playfully stuck out her tongue, "Catch me if you can." But that she performed a perfect backward somersault, her body diving into the water, kicking up splashes which drenched Naruto once again. The blonde shook himself, looked at the disturbed water surface, and grinned. "What, you think I can't swim?" He took a few careful hops before jumping into the air in a chakra-propelled leap and streamlining his body dived into the water, following his student through the clear lake. Both flew through the water as if being in such a place was as natural as breathing. Aayla continues to lead Naruto on, performing beautiful and tantalizing acrobatics to keep herself just out of her teacher's reach. She hadn't had so much fun in years. Both were completely unaware that a single clone trooper was watching them from the far side of the lake, looking through the scope of his sniper rifle. He had a perfect shot at Ayla's head, but didn't take it. Instead, he began discreetly sending a communique to his superiors. "Thanks for watching my video, see you next time, till then sayonara."